Hi, thanks for tuning in to episode number 41 of the Doctor Podcast show. We really appreciate your watching and please subscribe and follow. And if you like this episode, which I'm sure you will, please click on the like and the repost button as well. Today, we're discussing a very interesting and important topic. We're going to be discussing tattoos and tattoo toxicity. Are tattoos really safe or are they dangerous? And our expert today is Dr. John Swierk. Dr. Swierk is a Ph.D. in chemistry. He's an assistant professor of chemistry at Binghamton University, which is part of the State University of New York, very prestigious institution. And he's an expert in tattoos and will let us know if they're safe or not. So, John, thanks for taking the time to come today. I really appreciate it. How did you become interested in chemistry, first of all?
I was always sort of fascinated in kind of complex questions, right? I in high school I was really interested in how computer processors overheated, and I thought it'd be great to really understand everything from sort of the atomic level all the way up to sort of bulk materials and think about how you could couple those things to solve it. And as I proceeded through college and specialized a little bit more into chemistry, but my passion and interest is still sort of thinking about complicated problems that happen over multiple scales from sort of atoms and larger.
Right. Very interesting. And you eventually got a PhD in inorganic chemistry. I remember
Yeah.
I was a chemistry major in college also before I went to medical school. And I always loved chemistry. I loved organic chemistry especially. And that's kind of what led me to get into medicine. Now, how did you become interested in tattoos from chemistry?
So one of the major themes of my lab is just thinking about how light can be used to drive chemistry. Um, and sort of by chance, was reading a lot about tattoos and thinking about, how could you use them maybe as diagnostic tools? And in reading the literature, I noticed a very simple question was left unanswered, which is why does light cause a tattoo to fade, right? Every day, millions of people with exposed tattoos, their tattoos are slowly fading. We know that light accelerates that process. We don't really understand why. And then, of course, laser tattoo removal is a multiple billion-dollar a year industry that's just growing.
Really,
And the science
billions
behind
a
it,
year
yeah,
to
and the
remove
science, at
tattoos.
least it's huge, right? There's an estimate that something like a third of people who get a tattoo will eventually want to have it removed, right? So it gives you something about the size of the scale of that industry globally. And it turns out that the science behind that is surprisingly um, unsolved, right? That the whole sort of laser tattoo removal industry is based on a bunch of assumptions from a paper in the 70s that has nothing to do with tattoos. And
Really?
so we just thought this was a totally fascinating question, and it really aligned with what we liked to study. I have expertise in sort of molecules and materials, and so it was an interesting challenge. And since then, it's led us down a whole variety of interesting and unique kind of directions.
That's very fascinating. So when did people first start getting tattoos? I'm sure you probably researched the history of tattoos. How far back does tattooing go?
I mean, ancient times, prehistory, right? I mean, the Egyptians had tattoos. The Icemen we find sometimes have had tattoos. So tattooing has been a part of the human experience since we began recording history. Um, and that is still true to this day.
So it's present throughout various cultures in different
Mhm.
parts of the world.
Yeah.
Everybody had the idea to do tattoos. Now, in recent years, tattoos have become incredibly popular. I see them everywhere, especially in the summer when people
Mhm.
wear less clothing. And also there are TV shows about it, and it's social media is filled with it. Why has it become so popular? And what's your estimate of how many people in the USA have tattoos?
So there are a lot of estimates that fly around. It's hard to really get an accurate number because the number is so large. But, I think there are estimates that something like 30 to 40% of people under 30 have at least one tattoo. In Europe, the numbers are even higher. Um, for a long time, tattooing was very much something that was done in the shadows and was very socially frowned upon. And, you know, at some point in the last 20 to 30 years, that's really started to change. People are much more comfortable showing their tattoos. And when you talk to folks that get tattoos, they have a lot of reasons for getting them. More often than not, the tattoo is very special. It has a lot of meaning to them. It can be therapeutic in some cases, as a way to deal with trauma. Um, you know, obviously tattoos have been a form of expression throughout all of human history. So there's a lot of reasons that people get tattoos, and I think as more people get tattoos and are more open about their tattoos, it paves the way for other folks to feel comfortable getting a tattoo and displaying that as well.
Hmm. So when you get a tattoo, what part of the skin does that color or the pigment go into?
So our best understanding of the tattooing process, and you would be surprised how much of this is sort of based on assumption and not necessarily on hard research fact. But our best understanding of when you get a tattoo is that during the tattooing process, you have a needle that's moving very fast. Sometimes it's a group of needles that's puncturing the skin. And one of the things that I think is often sort of mistaken about tattoos is that it's not an injection of ink into the skin, right? What's happening is that you're making a series of puncture wounds across the surface of the skin. And then we are trying to study this in my lab, but there are some sort of amateur videos with people taken with high-speed cameras. What happens is that those needle strikes keep deforming the skin. And so all of those puncture wounds you just had keep sort of reversibly deforming, and that slowly channels the ink into the skin. And that's the process by which the ink is sort of inserted into the skin. Um, we know it sits in the dermal layer, usually a couple of millimeters below the surface of the skin. That's where a lot of the art of tattooing comes in, right? There's a lot of variation in terms of skin across the body. Some places are easier to tattoo, some are harder. In some places, the tattoo holds longer, in some places it doesn't. But the best picture that we have is that once the ink and the pigment is inserted into the skin, that white blood cells will sort of encapsulate that pigment, and then through a process of sort of regular die-off and replenishment, sort of hold the pigment there. Now, how they actually do that is still something of an open question, but that's our best sort of model of it. And what stays in the skin long term, we assume, is the pigment in the ink, right? So ink is made up of both pigment, which is the material with color, and then some kind of carrier package or vehicle, which is the sort of liquid, it's mostly alcohol, water that the pigment is suspended into. And so the assumption is that that carrier package drains away in the skin, and then the pigment is what stays behind in the dermal layer permanently.
Hmm. So knowing that, do we know whether this pigment and the substances in the ink might possibly travel to other parts of the body?
So research is definitely clear that pigment moves. Now, we don't know when pigment moves. We don't know if pigment is moving in the body during the tattooing process, and at that point, at some point it becomes static in the skin. We don't know if it's moving constantly over, a time span of years, but there is very clear research that demonstrates that pigment from tattooings that was, say, deposited in the forearm will end up in the lymph nodes. And in fact, that can be a challenge from a medical standpoint in terms of misdiagnosis, right? There are documented instances in the literature of heavily tattooed individuals, or sometimes not even that heavily tattooed individuals, where ink has accumulated in their lymph nodes and led to a misdiagnosis because the lymph nodes are now discolored and there's some concerns with it. So we know that the ink can move. And, we think that if you get your tattoo removed with a laser, we think that that is somehow disrupting the ink. and causing it to become mobile in the skin and the body, and that's how it's leaving the skin. Although, again, that process is not well understood. But we definitely have evidence that ink moves.
So you were saying that we don't know exactly what happens to the ink, where it goes to.
Mhm. So the research is clear that the pigment can move at times in the skin. We've seen it accumulate in lymph nodes. We assume that laser tattoo removal disrupts the pigment in some way and makes it mobile in the skin. We also know too that if your tattoo is badly placed by an artist, right? If it's too deep, you can have a phenomenon called blowout, where that you can actually sort of see lines that were crisp become very blurred, right? Because the pigment is clearly moving away from where it was deposited. So there's plenty of evidence that the pigment can move in the skin, but we don't understand the mechanism, the time scale, and sort of the limits of that.
Now, if it goes to lymph nodes and it causes enlargement of the lymph nodes, then potentially that could be a mistaken diagnosis of cancer or
Yep.
other conditions. So there are risks.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is documented in the literature of cases of misdiagnosis because of exactly what you're talking about.
Right. And now you've done extensive research on the inks within the tattoos, and there are
Yeah.
apparently several dozen different inks that are used. Uh, what do these inks contain? And I've read that some of them contain toxic substances like lead, and mercury, and other heavy metals, which are known to cause a variety of different diseases.
So all tattoo ink is made up of pigment and some kind of carrier package. And I think one of the things that surprises most people is that the sort of palette of pigments that's used in tattooing is surprisingly small, right? There's really um it's starting to change a little bit because of some regulations in the European Union, but there's really only one pigment that's used for blue tattoos. There's really only one pigment that's used for green tattoos. There's a very small set of yellows and reds and oranges that's used. All white tattoos are titanium dioxide. All black is pretty much carbon black. So there's a really small set of pigments that are used. And you have to understand that these pigments were not selected through a process where the discussion was, how do we design a pigment for use in tattooing? These are pigments that were largely selected during the last century by artists who were working with different raw pigments that were available primarily to artists, and sort of over time figured out which pigments had the best color fastness, which had sort of the best workability, which caused the least amount of problems with clients. And so the industry sort of coalesced around this set of pigments, and that's largely what's used. There are concerns with the pigments. One of the things that's important to really understand around tattooing is that there are things that I think, based on the literature, you would say are a concern and merit further study and are something that people who want to get a tattoo should at least decide if they're comfortable with that risk. But the science around the safety of tattoos, and we can discuss that at length, is totally open. It's totally unsettled. And so, for example, there have been studies that have shown some tattooings having a high level of mercury or lead. But what we don't understand is that mercury or lead bioavailable, right? Can the body access it? Maybe when it's just in the tattoo, it's just sitting there inert and doesn't cause a problem. And then that's where the question of what happens with light comes into play, right? Because maybe it's fine, but then once you laser it off, it's not. There are concerns around a lot of azo-containing pigments. So these are a lot of your reds, some of your yellows, and your oranges. And they're pigments that contain a linkage between two nitrogen atoms. And in other contexts, it's been documented that these pigments can break down and release potentially carcinogenic molecules. But we don't understand if that's happening in tattoos. And even if it is, do those molecules become available to the body? the typical black pigment that's used. There are documented instances of that containing, being contaminated with carcinogens. But again, we don't know if that's present in some, all, or no tattoo inks. And so there's a lot of questions around the pigments and the safety of the pigments that we just don't understand. And, a lack of research until fairly recently, um, really has sort of hindered being able to understand those questions. And it's something that now you're seeing more regulations that are demanding sort of safety substantiation, that those questions are really starting to come into the forefront.
Right. Speaking of regulation, my understanding is that the FDA does not regulate tattooing, and it also doesn't regulate the different inks that are used in the tattoo process. Is that correct?
Yeah, so historically, the FDA, even though they sort of notionally claimed authority over tattooings, really didn't exert any regulatory authority. And on the rare times where there would be a recall because of, say, bacterial contamination, that was typically voluntarily done with manufacturers. It's important to note that there is no pigment that's approved for insertion into the skin in this country. So strictly speaking, all tattooings are not FDA approved, but the FDA has chosen not to do anything with that. At the end of 2022, Congress passed a bill called MOCRA that updated cosmetic regulations for the first time since the late 30s. And as part of that, there's now an explicit sort of mandate to FDA to regulate and be more involved in the tattoo industry than in the past. So right now, the FDA, state and federal regulators, ink manufacturers, artist groups are trying to figure out what implementation of MOCRA is going to look like and how that's going to reshape the tattoo industry. Some early things have started, but it's not sort of a fully implemented program yet.
It's interesting. So almost a third of the population has tattoos, especially in the younger age group, but it's not really regulated. Now, if you're getting tattoos, how do you know where that ink came from? Is there a limited number of companies that make the different inks for tattoos, or can anybody create their own pigment and ink and just sell it, or do individual tattoo artists make their own ink? How does that work?
So it's yes to all of those questions. There are, you know, a limited set of companies that make tattooings that are available for sale in the US. Um, Counterfeit ink is a known issue, right? So this is where, the number one recommendation we give to people is work with, a serious professional artist if you're going to get a tattoo. And those are people that are going to be buying from, a major manufacturer and presumably not getting counterfeit ink. Some artists still choose to make their own inks, right? They'll buy the raw pigment, blend it. Tattoo ink as a sort of commercial product is relatively recent, only within the last 20 or 30 years. Up until that point, individual artists would buy pigment, make their own ink, and then tattoo with that. Um,
How did they sterilize that ink? Because,
um,
as you know, there are many reports of serious skin infections and other types of infections from tattoos. So, if you're going to somebody who's giving you a tattoo, how do you know that that ink is sterile and won't give you some horrible infection?
so, I think that's a question for each individual artist. I don't think there is a standard for if you're making your own ink, how you're supposed to treat it. Um, a lot of the ink is, the carrier package is typically pretty heavy on isopropyl alcohol or ethyl alcohol, right? So, rubbing alcohol or grain alcohol, which would have a sterilization sort of effect in some cases. But again, right? There are issues with commercial tattoo inks that should undergo rigorous sterilization processes being contaminated with microorganisms. So um, that's an issue sort of a across all levels of this industry.
Right. So the companies who make the ink, the more popular companies, are these names we would recognize, or are these major consumer brands, or are these kind of mom and pop companies all over the country?
So I don't think the average person would recognize most of the brands, right? There are things like Intense Inks or World Famous. Um, but some of these ink brands are owned by private equity groups that specialize in tattooing, and these private equity groups are have valuations over $1 billion, right? So
Good.
they're large companies, right? Large companies with significant volume. At least, in some cases, some of them have sales on the order of tens of millions of dollars a year, right? And it's not uncommon for one company to have multiple ink lines. It's not uncommon for one sort of overall corporation to own multiple ink manufacturers. So they're serious commercial operation, which is why some of our work that has sort of highlighted real deficiencies in the manufacturing is so surprising to us, because this is not your friend down the street making ink in their garage. These are companies with global footprints that are doing this.
What's the total tattoo market in the USA? Do you know? I mean, how much money is spent on tattooing?
Oh, it's I don't know a specific number, but it's enormous, right? Because just the ink market alone is probably running into the tens of millions of dollars or more per year in just the US. And then, within the context of getting a tattoo, the cost of the ink is a relatively small percentage of what the overall cost of the tattoo is, right? A skilled artist is making hundreds or even thousands of dollars per hour to tattoo. Um, and the best artists are in demand constantly. People are flying in to work with them. So, you know, it just gives you an idea, right, of sort of the scale that we're talking about here.
So this is a multi-billion-dollar industry, basically.
Yeah, certainly globally it is, definitely. Maybe even so in the US.
Now, you have become an expert in analyzing the inks. How do you do that? What technology or what techniques do you use to figure out what's in the ink?
Yeah, so one of the real challenges is that tattoo ink as a sort of chemical system is really complicated, right? You have a lot of components that behave very differently. You have things that are solids, you have things that are just sort of molecular. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about how do you sort of separate these two things. We use distillation a lot to try to separate out the different components. And then we use a variety of analytical chemistry techniques to try to tease out, what's in the ink. But it's a challenge, and it takes a long time, right? And it takes a lot of tools sort of working together. And even then, we're still only relatively confident about assigning the things that are at a very high concentration. The analogy I gave last summer at a regulator conference is that it's sort of like going outside with a stack of papers, and some papers are really large and some are really small, and then tearing them all up into little bits and then throwing it all over your grass, right? And now you have to try to rummage through the grass to find, you know, bits of paper to reassemble what's going on. And so maybe the big pieces of paper, you find enough chunks to figure out what's on there, but something that's the size of a post-it note, maybe you miss it, right? Or maybe you can't really be sure what's on there. So that kind of gives you a sense of the challenge in doing this sort of work.
So even though you're an expert in this, you've still only mastered the tip of the iceberg, it sounds like.
Yeah, we think so. And one of the challenges that we have run into is that there have been a lot of things that we found in inks that aren't listed on the bottle. And so if you know what you're looking for, it's a lot easier to find it than if you're getting chemical signals that could relate to one of 100 possible molecules. And so we we've sort of had to be very cautious in what we do and really look for multiple techniques to validate that yes, this is what we found.
I see. So you use different types of analysis, and if
Mhm.
several of them agree with each other, then you know what the substance is.
Exactly. Exactly.
What's the difference between a tattoo and henna? I've seen popularity of henna tattoos. What's the difference between those two things?
So I'll admit I'm not an expert in henna, but my sense is right is that it's a crushed leaf with a pigment that sort of stains the skin. But it's not necessarily something that's being, driven into the dermal layer, right? It's still sort of right on the epidermis there, which is why it doesn't last and it sort of flakes off. Um,
How long does it last?
um, it's not permanent. My sense is maybe a week or two, but it could be a little bit longer to
So
to
it's
be honest.
probably safer to have henna because it's on the surface of the skin. It really doesn't go deeper into the skin where the blood vessels are, and the blood vessels may transport it to other parts of the body, and it kind of fades out after a few weeks.
Yeah, I don't know about it. I don't know how much work has been done looking at, sort of potential concerns with henna. It's an interesting question. It's similar in the same sense that it's still an ink, so you've got a pigment and you've got some kind of carrier package that's helping to sort of suspend the ink. Um, but it's not penetrating deep into the skin, so it's not a permanent body modification.
Right. Now, you mentioned several times reputable companies, reputable artists. I looked at the FDA website. They also suggest that you get a reputable person to do this. How do you figure out who's reputable and who's not, since it's not regulated and anybody can really do it?
There are a few things that you can look for. When you're talking to a potential artist, you can ask about their training, right? Uh, reputable artists will have done an extensive apprenticeship with somebody. They'll have trained under an experienced, you know, uh, senior tattoo artist. So that's sort of a good one to look for. Two, a reputable artist is going to be really focused on sanitation, hygiene. Um, that's something that I think people can sort of spot, right? Are they using gloves? Are they following health codes? Are they um, disposing of waste as sort of a potential biohazard, right? Are they following all of the steps that you would basically expect if you went to a doctor's office, right?
Right.
Do you get the same sense that you're dealing with that level of sort of professionalism around sanitation? If you go into a studio and the area where well, if any part of the studio is dirty or it's not clean, and in particular the tattooing space, that would be a red flag. Um, Certainly asking other people that have gotten a tattoo with them, what has been the outcome, right? Look at their work. Are there problems with their lines blowing out, meaning the ink isn't staying into place? Are the lines sort of, are they pulling a straight line that tells you something about their level of experience and expertise? Or does it sort of look, does the previous work sort of look poorly constructed, right? That would be a red flag for somebody who's maybe not skilled and is sort of cutting short the training experience. But there is no formal um, training program. There's no formal accreditation. There is the Alliance of Professional Tattooists. It's called APT. It's a large tattoo organization. There's a lot of focus on both advocacy and education. So I think if you are working with an artist that's, belonging to some sort of professional organization, again, it's another sign, because the best tattoo artists are ones that have really made this their calling and their craft and really want the best outcomes for their clients. And so that means continually educating, engaging with the community to find out, are there problems? Are people seeing problems with inks? Are there, new best practices in aftercare that they should be using? How do they, how do they really appropriately sterilize their equipment? What's the best sort of hygiene practices? Your best artists are going to be thinking about all of those things.
Right. I've also read that the since the tattoo ink contains some heavy metals, there
Mhm.
have occasionally been problems in patients who've had MRI scans where the MRI is a strong magnetic field and can cause problems with tattoos. Do you know how common that is?
It's not common, and sort of metal contamination in tattoos, certainly the last time it was really looked at in depth was maybe 10 or 12 years ago in a study that came out of Europe. And there were causes for concern there. Um, in terms of being able to elicit an MRI response, there are documented cases, but it doesn't seem like it's a regular or common occurrence. But again, one of the problems that my work and my group's work has really highlighted, and other people that study tattoos have sort of suggested the same thing, is that there are serious deficiencies in ink manufacturing in terms of just the process, right? In terms of following good manufacturing practices, careful sourcing. Um, we have found lots of unlisted ingredients in the inks. Other people have found, and issues with, even like the wrong pigment being listed, or correct pigments just not being listed at all. And you sort of think about manufacturing at scale, and you think about something like the food industry, which is sort of highly regulated, and there's a lot of trust that what you get out of your food package is going to be exactly what's on the label.
Right.
But tattoo ink manufacturing really isn't there. And so we don't know, are things in the inks because companies chose to add something and decided not to declare it? Or is it just they're buying materials from a third party and adding it to the inks and don't necessarily know what's in there? Either case, it still represents a failure of the manufacturing practice that needs to be addressed.
Right. The inks that you've studied, have you studied it from the major artists who have
Mhm.
credible reputations?
Yeah.
Are there problems with their ink as well?
So we recently published a study where we looked at 54 inks, 6 inks from 9 different manufacturers, and we talked a lot to tattoo artists about what they considered to be sort of good premium industry leading inks, all the way down to sort of quote unquote bad inks. And we found problems across the board. 45 of the 54 inks had what we characterized as a major discrepancy, meaning that there was at least one unlisted component in that ink, whether it was the wrong pigment or some kind of additive in the carrier package. And again, those problems were from inks that are really top of the market, right? Huge volume, widely used, to sort of small trainer inks that you'd buy off of Amazon. It wasn't, there were problems across the board.
Wow, that's pretty frightening. Sounds to me like it's similar to the vaping industry where people are vaping and there's all sorts of chemicals and substances in the smoke that they're inhaling, some of which can cause cancer and other lung diseases. Is that a good analogy?
I think it's a good analogy in a lot of respects. Of course, one of the differences is that, tattooing as an art form has been around for a long time. So it's a much more mature discipline, and people have been getting tattoos for a long time. So we have a better sense, at least generally, about some of the potential risks around tattooing. Whereas vaping, I know there are parallels with smoking cigarettes and cigars, but it's kind of different. So I think the big difference there is the duration of time, but in terms of sort of the manufacturing and knowing what's in it, yeah, I think unfortunately there's a lot of parallels between the two.
Right. Now, many states have age restrictions. I think it's 18. Under 18, you can't get a tattoo unless your
Mhm.
parents approve it. Do you think that's a good idea?
I personally think it's a good idea, and to be honest with you, nearly every artist I've ever spoken with also agrees it's a good idea. While certainly teenagers can be very mature, getting a tattoo requires balancing the fact that this is a permanent modification. There may be some degree of risk that we don't fully understand yet, and that's a decision that I think is best made when people are a little bit older. And for a lot of artists, their concern is that every artist I've ever talked to has some story about a 16-year-old kid that brought their older friend in to try to get him to sign off to get a tattoo, and then the parent comes and says, "Why did you tattoo my 16-year-old kid?" And so just eliminating it, I think, is often in sort of everybody's best interest.
That's a good idea. You have a website that's
Mhm.
specific for the tattoos and ink. What's that website address? And I'll post it on the interview.
what'sinmyink.com. And we're working on
Good name.
updating it with the results of our latest study. Eventually we'd like to get to a point where maybe high school and college chemistry classes can be sort of looking at inks on their own and, flagging things that might be worth evaluating further, providing some information about what they're seeing in tattoo ink. But we're not there yet, but that's the goal someday.
What'sinmyink.com.
Yes, sir.
All right. I'll make sure and post that. Last question. I'm really curious. Would you have a tattoo knowing everything that you know and have researched?
Yeah, I think so. I don't have any tattoos, and I'm not planning to get a tattoo, although at this point, one of the big obstacles to getting a tattoo is that I feel like I know too many artists that would all want, if I was going to get a tattoo, that would all want to give me a tattoo. So there's no going from 0 to 1 tattoo. It's going from like 0 to 10. And I don't know that I'm fully ready for it.
Right,
Um,
because whoever does your tattoo will become world famous overnight because that will imply that you've researched it and this is the best tattoo artist using the best and safest inks, right?
I can't say that, but I think one of the points I really try to make a lot is that we're not anti-tattoo. And if people want to get a tattoo, they should be allowed to do that. Our focus is really on a couple of things. One, with our analytical work on tattooings, it's trying to draw attention to the fact that there is this discrepancy between what people are being told is in their ink and what's actually in the ink. And we think that artists and clients have a right to know what's in the ink, right? There may be things that are
Yeah.
that are perfectly safe, don't have known toxicity in inks, but for some segment of the population have a known allergen, right? We found propylene glycol in 15 of the 54 inks. That's generally considered to be non-toxic, but for a very small segment of the population, it's a very significant allergen. And you can get blistering, you can get a lot of itching, pain. If you know you have an allergy to propylene glycol, you should have a right to say, please don't use that ink on me.
Right.
So that's one of our big sort of areas of focus. We have a ton of respect for artists, and a lot of the times our motivation is trying to empower them to do better for their clients and just making people aware of where things stand, right? There are some causes for concern. We don't have an answer to the question about are tattoos safe. It's a very complicated question that doesn't have an easy answer yet because so much of the basic science hasn't been put into place. So we can't say that tattoos are unsafe by any means. but we can highlight that there are some things that, may give some people pause. If people look at that and they say, you know what, I'm okay with it, then great, go ahead and get a tattoo, right? The things where we know that there's a problem are working with an unskilled artist in sort of poor sanitary conditions, poor aftercare, right? We know that those can cause a problem. And so as long as you're working with a good artist and you accept that the science underlying tattoos and questions of safety around tattoos are just not settled, then, go ahead, have fun, right? Tattoos can be a beautiful form of self-expression.
Right. So this has been very educational for me, I'm sure to the public watching as well. And the key thing is for people to know that there are potential risks and things we just don't know yet. I think it's assumed out there that, oh, it's safe, everybody has it, millions of people have it, no problem. But that's not the case. And maybe in the future we might find out some things that are bad about tattoos. But at least being informed from programs like this is really important. So I'd like to thank you for taking the time from your busy schedule to join us on the Doctor Podcast show and educate us about this.
It was a real pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on.
Okay, thank you.